Welcome. This is an English summary of my presentation in Italian, translated using AI. In this work, we will explore a paradigm shift in full range and subwoofer alignment, introducing the rising point and subwoofer second oscillation methods. Both leverage linear broadband IR in the live IR in Smaart, a tool that, for this purpose, has been traditionally avoided in this software. For decades, live event alignment has been treated like a game on a screen, simply matching traces while continuously playing pink noise. But relying solely on the phase trace has structural limitations, especially in complex environments. It is time to stop playing with screens and start integrating the time domain alongside the frequency domain. This is the only way to truly eliminate uncertainty. There are some limits to previous alignment method. First, we are not an omni microphone. Our hearing is much more complex. Aside from the different directional characteristics, an omni microphone is sensitive only to the pressure components of sound, while we are sensitive also to its vectorial component. And finally, the room, which so strongly influences what we hear and measure. A universal principle of physics binds everything we measure, the second law of thermodynamics, and the related concept of entropy. Every system increases its disorder over time, losing its original information. In the real world, direct sound is lost as it moves through the room. The mathematics behind real-time analyzers lose consistency as direct sound is masked by noise or reverberation. In the near field, we get clean, reliable traces. But as we move into the semi-reverberant field, distance and absorption take their toll. Reflections and noise begin to predominate, and our analyzer becomes incapable of returning stable or even readable traces. This is the routine we are all used to. First, we send noise through the main, perform a fine delay, and save the trace as our reference. Next, we measure the subwoofer, adding delay if required, until the phase traces visually overlap. This process risks becoming a purely graphic alignment, based on a reference that we now know is vulnerable. But the phase trace is not always clear or useful. In a reverberant environment, the coherence drops completely across the spectrum, making a stable phase reading impossible. Without high coherence, due to a low direct-to-reverberant ratio, these data cannot identify a solid trend for our tuning. Small rooms present a different challenge, but the same risk. Even without full reverb, strong isolated reflections can break the original phase wrap. Like in this example, a reflection at 90 Hz breaks the phase trace in a critical alignment zone. This tricks the operator into adding too much delay to the subwoofer, aligning it to a reflection instead of the direct sound. Not only filters influence phase, physical factors like enclosures and boundaries deviate wavefronts, altering the trace readings and even the intrinsic response of the loudspeakers. For a deep dive into these effects, visit the article on my blog. The phase trace is not just a weak tool, it is subjective. Look at these three examples. Different operators will see different best overlaps, leading to uncertainty and doubt. To eliminate this human error, we must move toward an objective reference, one that leaves no room for interpretation. Even factory presets can trick you. In the real world, every situation demands specific tuning. Look at this A15 and KS21 example and what the preset guide says. The factory preset suggests adding exactly 2.3 milliseconds to the subwoofer. Visually, the phase traces fall within the so-called phase corridor, and we do hear a summation, but your ears tell a different story. You lose focus, impact, and transient response. The time domain reveals the truth. The signals are desynchronized. What looks good enough in phase is actually misaligned in time. Linear broadband IR in Smaart. When we measure a full-range system, Smaart shows a sharp, clear impulse in the linear IR. But look at the subwoofer. The screen appears empty. There seems to be no information at all. Yet, the data is there. Smaart doesn't have a tool like normalization in linear view, but you can simply zoom in using the plus key. Now, the subwoofer waveform is clear and easy to see. However, zooming also increases the background noise. If the SN ratio is low or there is impulsive noise, the reading becomes unstable. We can fix this with some specific software settings later. So, it is possible to use the linear IR for the time domain alignment of a top subsystem. For more details, you can check the articles and videos on my blog and YouTube channel. But now, let's look at a brief summary of the general principles behind the methods we are about to present. In an ideal system, there is no filtering, delay, or distortion. If we send a perfect impulse at time t, the signal passes through the system unchanged. But in the real world, an ideal system does not exist. However, every device in the audio chain introduces phase shift and temporal smearing. Any filtering process changes the impulse response. One of the most confusing topics in our industry is the difference between time arrival, or propagation delay, and inherent phase shift. While time arrival represents the gap in space and time that can be fixed with signal delay in a DSP, phase shift is different. It changes the waveform envelope because of the system's own construction and processing. Phase shift cannot be fixed with signal delay. It requires specific filtering to correct the actual shape of the signal. While phase shift is difficult to interpret in the frequency domain, it immediately manifests as smearing and waveform alteration in the time domain. As shown in this subwoofer comparison, the time domain provides a clearer view of construction, processing, and environmental influences. Therefore, correctly displaying the waveform and the system's IR is crucial. Unfortunately, many analyzers fail by not providing an IR sharp enough to distinguish these phenomena. This leaves the operator blind to the true nature of the misalignment. Here we have the DSP output without filters, except at the band edges. Assuming this is a perfect system, we see a single peak at a specific time t. This represents our reference impulse before any processing or physical alteration. Now, let's add an LPF. Notice how the IR spreads out and becomes more complex. However, pay close attention to the black circle. That point is exactly the same as it was before the filtering. While the rest of the waveform changes, the initial starting point remains unmoved. Now, applying an HPF causes the IR to stretch even further, creating an even more complex shape. However, the result remains the same. The rising point stays in its exact original position. Even after adding EQ filters, the initial point, our rising point, stays exactly where it belongs. While the waveform envelope changes and the smearing increases along the time axis, that first point is still there. This final test confirms it as a solid and stable reference for our alignment. The start points represent the true physical arrival of the sound. These are the very first movements of air captured by the microphone, emerging above the noise floor. These points serve as a reliable timestamp of the speaker's position in space. It is the absolute reference that defines exactly when the sound reaches our measurement point. Everything that follows, the entire remaining waveform, is simply the result of phase shift. While the filters alter the shape of the wave, they cannot change the moment the sound first arrives. Looking at these two subwoofers, we see the same waveform envelopes and start points perfectly synchronized. This confirms that the subwoofers are of the same type and are in the same physical position. In this case, even though the start points are still synchronized, the waveform envelopes are very different. This is due to the different construction and processing of the two subwoofers. Phase trace is time-blind, and it is impossible to find starting points in it. The operator depends only on the slope of the phase trace. Before I start to illustrate the methods, a preliminary optimization of Smaart Suite is necessary. To get a clear live IR and find the rising points, we need to adjust the software settings. This step is crucial to avoid noise and ensure a stable reading of the waveform, especially for subwoofers. Inside the Advanced tab, we must activate these highlighted transfer function settings: LIFFT, FTW, and sync source. For a detailed explanation of these technical functions, please refer to the official Smaart support documentation. To optimize the live IR reading, we must set the signal generator to pseudo-random, matching the transfer function length. For the stimulus, we use synchronized mode. Once that LIFFT is active, the live IR can be displayed in two ways. One, LIFFT. It uses an absolute time axis. This mode offers a stable reading with a high SN ratio, making it very precise. 2. LIR. This is the classic live IR with a relative time axis. However, it is less stable and has a lower SN ratio compared to the first one. And now, I will explain the step-by-step procedure in Smaart. Rising point method. Rising point method. The case in this example assumes a small full-range speaker stacked on the top of a small 8-inch subwoofer in my room. By default, a 20 millisecond delay is inserted in the DSP to delay the top, to facilitate data reading and therefore for illustrative purposes only. The top is measured first, followed by the subwoofer. Step 1. Obtain a stable LIFFT with a high SN ratio, both for the top initially and the subwoofer. Step 2. Use the zoom, mouse selection, and plus button to clearly display the rising points of the waveforms, where they emerge from the background noise. If the window is not centered, when you zoom, help yourself to keep the rising point centered with the keyboard arrows. Step 3. Identify the full-range system's rising point, circled in red in the image, and read the time value in milliseconds with the mouse. You will now use this value as a time reference. If desired, you can repeat the measurement with this value in the Find Delay field, synchronizing the analyzer for these IR samples. Resave the measurement again in this case. Step 4. Now measure the subwoofer and similarly identify its IR rising point, reading its absolute value in the LIFFT or LIR. Apply the necessary signal delay so that the two starting points coincide perfectly on the time axis. In the LIFFT, highlighted in yellow is the absolute time value relative to 0 in ms, while in green is the relative time value relative to the sync point, which is essentially the delay time we'll need to insert into the DSP to synchronize the subwoofer's IR rising point with the top's IR rising point. And in fact, if you think about the data, this is nothing more than the default 20 milliseconds we inserted by default, plus just enough delay to align a top placed on a small subwoofer. At the same time, note the subwoofer's phase trace, which is ahead. Essentially, we now have both domains under control and can see in real time what happens in each as we add delay, but with the certainty of the rising point as visual reference. Step 5. Once we've introduced approximately 20.7 milliseconds of delay into the subwoofer's out in the DSP, the rising point of its impulse response has moved close to the sync point, and the systems can be considered synchronized in time. But as we can see, they are also aligned in the frequency domain, the two phase traces having the same slope in the crossover zone. It is clear that to complete the optimization of the combined response of the two systems, a polarity inversion is necessary in this specific case. Subwoofer second oscillation method. We now apply the steps described above to implement the second method. It should be noted that the latter, under ideal conditions, represents a complementary approach to the first. However, the rising point method remains the most robust and straightforward method for interpreting the data. Again, I will not delve into some of the theoretical content, so I will assume that readers have acquired knowledge. Step 1. Measure the top. For now, we will perform automatically find delay with the peak of the linear IR, LIR, just for system verification evaluations. Step 2. we change the sync point with the tracking plus/minus buttons after making the appropriate settings in the options to synchronize with the IR samples, which bring us to be synchronized in the phase trace with the frequencies falling within the crossover region. We can now remove the first saved top trace from the view. Step 3. Let's measure the subwoofer and try to zoom in while maintaining a good view of the subwoofer's waveform and time reference. What we need to do now is identify the second peak of the subwoofer waveform starting from 0 from the first oscillation. This method is the result of various field tests. The delta time between the center of the peak of the second oscillation of the subwoofer waveform and the time reference point, the synchronization point from step 2, represents the delay value to be entered into the DSP to synchronize the top and subwoofer. Let's enter the value and see what happens. As we can see, the center of the second oscillation's peak has been brought roughly to the reference point. The phase trace has assumed roughly the same slope as that of the top, and therefore the two systems can be considered synchronized. We will certainly refine the alignment further, but first, as in the previous case, we need to invert the polarity to ensure the systems add correctly. This method is more crude and tends to lead the operator back to an alignment based on the phase trace. In reality, analyzing the rising points will demonstrate that they are already close or synchronized, confirming the compatibility between the two approaches. The second method, however, is much more sensitive to measurement conditions. It is affected by the phase shift, which, by distorting the waveform, makes it difficult to identify the center of the second oscillation's peak. Furthermore, using the LIR makes the measurement more vulnerable to the potential problems of low SN. Conclusions. This work has highlighted how relying exclusively on the phase trace in optimizing sound systems presents structural limitations, especially in acoustically complex environments. The vulnerability of this tool to operator subjectivity and environmental changes necessitates an integrated approach that includes the time domain. The introduction of the methods presented based on the use of linear broadband IR for software that not have advanced specific tools of visualization and analysis of IRs, the rising point method, and the subwoofer second oscillation method marks a paradigm shift in the use of Smaart. While the latter method offers a phase-dependent confirmation perspective, the rising point method has proven to be the most robust and objective tool for identifying the time arrival from separated in space sources, regardless of the phase shift introduced by processing and construction, which can potentially be corrected with advanced filtering methods. In conclusion, operating simultaneously in the two domains allows us to eliminate interpretative uncertainties, ensuring an alignment that is not only mathematically coherent, but ultimately responsive to the transient nature of the musical event.